So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Kristofer Ekberg from Chalmers to talk with us today. And Kristofer is going to be talking about a paper he's published very recently and the findings from there. The paper is A Road to Denial, Climate Change and Neoliberal Thought in Sweden, 1988 to 2000. It's obviously a super important topic. And we're really interested we hear an awful lot about the neoliberal paradigm and how we're locked into it and how how we're gonna solve the climate crisis with this paradigm. It's gonna be so interesting listening to Kristofer taking on this really challenging topic. Kristofer, a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. The floor is now yours. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. And see there. Okay.
That all looks great. You're ready to go. I'm going to turn my camera off as well now.
Great. And I'm going to try to hide that. So my name is Kristofer Ekberg, and I'm an historian from Lund University, where I did my PhD there, but right now working at Chalmers University of Technology, researching climate obstruction, which, in other words, this connotes ways to deny the need for addressing climate crisis or delay efforts aiming to do so. So I'm really happy to be invited to talk with you today, and I will be giving this talk based on my and Victor Pressfeldt's article, A Road to Denial, which was published last fall in the journal Contemporary European History. So, within research on climate denial and delay, it has, ever since the publication of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's hugely influential book, Merchants of Doubt, been known that one thing that brought together the opposition to climate policy was an aversion to anything resembling socialism, and especially any form of government planning. So some research from the US also points to the fact that anti-environmentalism became a thing that brought different strands of conservative and libertarian groups together, some of which in previous periods had been working for environmental protection. But in the 1970s, this changed. So research has since then investigated the ties between fossil fuel corporations and neoliberal and conservative actors in the form of funding and discourse. Among them, these actors are several think tanks such as Heartland Institute, Fraser Institute, Cato Institute. So apart from being able to trace money and funding from corporations like fossil fuel companies like Exxon to think tanks, US scholars have also, and more recently, begun looking into how economists and PR companies have aided or led the groundworks for what is commonly described as a climate change counter movement. And for a long time, climate denial and delay were seen as a strategy nascent and rather exclusive to the US. And while it's true that opposition has been much more aggressive and vocal there than in Europe, scholars from Germany, Spain, and Sweden, among others, have in recent years tracked how opposition looks in this region as well. This research in turn has mainly been occupied with more recent periods, and especially the merge of climate denialism with far-right thought. So the paper that me and Victor has written started with the knowledge that some Swedish actors were early engaged in the US counter-movement, and also that the US think tanks most active in promoting climate denial and delay were part of the same networks as, for example, Swedish think tank Timbro. Timbro and others, such as Ratio more recently, also were and is collaborating with several of the think tanks present in the few existing studies of European climate obstruction that we have before this paper. This has been analyzed to some extent in research by, for example, Martin Hultman at my own department and Jonas Anselm, but also tracked by journalists and investigative blogs and books like Mats Nilsson's Spelet om klimatet. Further then, we also know that within this counter movement, economic arguments have been constantly pushed as a way to undermine climate policy efforts, as for example, Ben Franta has shown. And we see similar mobilizations of cost-benefit analysis in Swedish reports of later date, for example, the report's Effektiv klimatpolitik by Timbro. So what we did in this paper was basically to analyze the emergence of such debates coming from neoliberal and business-affiliated think tanks and actors in Sweden. And the ambition was to study the foundations of these arguments and what they imply in terms of willingness and possibility to act on environmental and societal problems like climate change. So after an initial survey, we identified 3 actors that were more influential and, in our eyes, more interesting to follow. So basically, we followed these actors within this business and neoliberal-oriented field from the late 1980s up until 2000s, with some, looking a little bit beyond that. The actors we focused on were Tor Ragnar Gerholm, physicist and longtime debater with Bert Bolin, the first chairman of IPCC, and Marian Radetzky, who was a resource economist and head of the Center for Business and Policy Study Working Group on Energy, and last Lars Bern, engineer and environmental consultant, and later climate denialist. So in the paper, we argued that these 3 actors exemplify different strands of a neoliberal thought style, sharing an idea that, first of all, markets are superior planning devices, and second, that it is the government's duty to implement this superior device in society, and third, when this is done, human ingenuity and innovation will be able to solve any problem. So while it's hard to argue that Swedish actors had specific material interests, like we have in the US, given the lack of fossil fuel extraction, or at least to any larger extent, it is evident that the actors showed that they were committed to economic theories that left a lot of options out of the question. So in the paper, we show how arguments from the neoliberal movement, and primarily those influenced by Friedrich von Hayek and Julian Simon, gained influence, and by consequence provided a rationale for inaction and effectively denial. So the paper's title is a riff on Hayek's most famous book, A Road to Serfdom, where he argued against socialism and state planning, which he deemed a sure way to end up with tyranny and the erasure of individual liberty. So our paper, A Road to Denial, does make the argument that some core tenets in neoliberal thinking and organization has eased and paved the way for denial and outright objections to climate policy, especially then policy enacted within and through state regulation. But as we show, the road to denial was not that simple. So we then show that climate change knowledge in the late 1980s and early 1990s initially provided arguments for neoliberal politics, since the diffuse and scattered emissions of carbon dioxide lent itself to an idea that they were hard to plan away. So instead, a more fine-grained mechanism of the market and consumer choice would address the issue. This was a position then promoted by, for example, Lars Bern, who in 1990 in this book, Medborgarnas miljömanifest, said that the emerging environmental commitment is really nothing more than another step in the long civilizational process of humanity. And in this discussion, previous environmental policies, so-called command and control policies, were deemed reasonable for that time, but not up for this new task. They needed new tools for that. Simultaneously, during this period, the late 1980s and early 1990s, the idea that growth would lead to environmentally friendly society was increasingly promoted. Marian Radetzky, for example, was the main proponent of this vision and argued on basis of the famous environmental Kuznets curve that as societies grew richer, they also grew increasingly green. This, in turn, provided arguments against the environmental movement, who, in Radetzky's view, wanted to go beyond what was needed. Importantly here, Radetzky adhered to a strictly anthropocentric worldview in which environmental problems only were problems if they were perceived as such by individuals, by human individuals. He could therefore argue in this book, Tillväxt och miljö, that the introduction of cars was environmentally beneficial since it removed horse manure from the streets. A take on this environmental Kuznets curve thinking is in this quote: "The rich are not only willing to abstain from consumption if this benefits the environment, they are also prepared to spend a growing share of their income to ensure access to environmental service of good quality." And this kind of argument, we could hear similar thoughts in the program Klimathoppet just a few days ago. So to simplify this, the green growth argument, capitalism would eventually solve any problem that arose. And a basis for this idea was also a Promethean vision of resources as always possible to substitute. So a resource was only a function, and therefore no definitive limits existed. This Promethean narrative had become common in the 1980s through Julian Simon and Herman Kahn's book, The Resourceful Earth, among other publications. And in Sweden, it was Gerholm that was its most active proponent. The pamphlet shown here, En bättre framtid, was published by the Confederation, or Swedish Employers Confederation, and the PR firm Kreab, both in Sweden and internationally. And both Gerholm and Radetzky was dismissive of the warnings from the newly instated IPCC in the late 1980s, and argued both that the science was uncertain and that if real, climate change was not really a problem. Gerholm even took part as scientific advisor in the infamous climate denialist organization SEPP, led by Fred Singer. So these three actors were in different ways affiliated to business interests and brought forth neoliberal thoughts, either as consultants, advisors, or investigators. But in the mid-1990s, the pro-market approach of Lars Bern would clash with the pro-industry view of Gerholm and Radetzky. This clash also coincided and was probably sparked by things like the lowering of the discount on the carbon tax for industry, Göran Persson's Green People's Home, the coming Kyoto meeting, as well as the first IPCC report explicitly linking anthropogenic emissions to warming. So the policies promoted by Bern and the organization he represented, the Natural Step, was targeted by Gerholm. The attack on the Natural Step was seen by Timbro as one part of their push to promote free market environmentalism, in line with similar efforts in the Atlas network, of which they were a member. So the first quote here is a description of this push from Timbro to describe the actual state of the world and push back prophecies of doom. And similarly, Mattias Bengtsson from Timbro wrote that today we are convinced that the agenda of the environmental movement threatens the values that Timbro is set to defend. So editorials from Svenska Dagbladet and others supported Gerholm, and this resulted later on that ban left the natural step. So while Gerholm continued to question the results from IPCC in the book Klimatpolitik efter Kyoto, which was published in 1998, others within the sphere of thought and organization began arguing that if Sweden should do anything, it has to be on the global level to prevent free riding. This was clearly also an argument against the local investment policies enacted under Persson in the late 1990s. So basically what was argued in, for example, the book you see here, Global Klimatpolitik from 2003, Lars Bergman and Marian Radetzky, and this book was funded partly by Swedish energy companies. The argument was that Sweden was already done and that efforts must be directed elsewhere. So in effect, this provided a rationale for inaction and effective denial of domestic policy. So the goal from all actors in our study was to protect domestic industry from international competition, not by subsidies, but through minimizing the burdens put on them through legislation, regulation, and taxation. Interestingly, the framing of climate policy as something to be addressed above the national polity was also something that kind of sparked or became a key talking point within the far right and conspiracy parts of the climate change counter movement, which Lars Bern, moving from his pro-environmental position, eventually sided with. So in this revealing quote from 2013, he said that the central ambition of today's activist environmental movement is to work for the implementation of a new world order. So pretty far off from what he said in the 1990s. So to summarize, what we show in the paper is how a number of actors, while diverging in more specific issues, could come together through their affiliation to neoliberal arguments in which collective decision-making and government planning based on scientific findings were opposed. And in this, we follow Wendy Brown and others such as Quinn Slobodian, who argued that these ideas and movements constitute an opposition to the idea of democratic planning and decision-making. So when acknowledged as real and serious, climate change is by neoliberals seen as a prime example of a complex problem that could only be addressed by markets and price signals, which together with human ingenuity and technological innovation almost automatically leads to improvements. This leaves no option for decisions based on future damages and disregard the idea of, for example, tipping points or thresholds in ecosystems. So while environmental movement often aim to protect the environment and society from the ravages of capitalism, what we see here is instead the efforts, sometimes blunt and sometimes subtle, to protect capital from society and environmental demands. So by tracing these arguments in Sweden, we add a nuance to a literature that sometimes solely equates opposition to climate policy with the action of fossil fuel companies, and also to the literature that places opposition only within the US. We also add to a discussion on the role of economic theory in shaping climate policy and responses to climate policy, and to the role of think tanks and others engaged with public opinion. But we also show how delay and opposition could look like in a country and situation where climate science, at least on a surface level, seems to be accepted by a majority of society. As such, we hope that our paper will also further our understanding of the dynamic way opposition changes over time, and that delay, not only denial of climate policy, has a longer history. Thank you. I'm going to stop share there.
Thank you very much for a really inspiring and interesting talk. And I'm sure that there are an enormous amount of questions. I'm just going to